Diane, thank you and Dr. Foley for inviting me to join you for this event. The Foley Foundation is doing great work in publicizing the plight of Americans wrongfully held by governments abroad and as hostages. And you've done great work in bringing them home and reuniting people with their friends and their families. I know that James is looking down on you from upstairs with pride in his heart at the great work that you and many others are doing in his name. So thank you for all of your efforts on behalf of Americans held captive overseas. Margot and Cynthia, thank you for the excellent work on the report that's being published today and it's being launched. It'll be of great benefit to American policymakers and those of us involved in trying to bring our fellow citizens home. As Special Presidential Envoy and as National Security Advisor, I work very closely with Secretary Chris Miller, with Sarah Levinson, with Mickey Bergman, and with Ambassador Roger Carstens. And I'm honored to be on the stage with them today. They are 100% committed to bringing Americans home and have done great work on that behalf. So thank you all for your work as well. When the Foley Foundation webpage is opened, there are 3 photos of hostages. I know those hostages well. I kept the photographs in my pocket, along with those of many others, every day that I served as the SPIHA and as the National Security Advisor. These 3 photos are of Austin Tice, Paul Overby, and Siamak Namazi. I truly believe that I could have brought all 3 of them home. I did my best, but I failed them and their families. And there are other Americans who will not come home alive, but who deserve to rest in peace in their native soil. And that includes Jim and Kayla and Peter and Stephen and Bob, who's been away the longest. To all the hostage and detainee families with loved ones overseas, I did my best. I wish I'd been more successful, but I'm now or have passed the baton to a new team, and they're going to work as hard or harder than I ever did. And we're not going to give up hope that you're going to see your loved ones again. During my time in office, we brought many Americans home, and President Trump rightly received praise and attention and acclamation for those rescues. And each of those returns was a blessing to the hostage or detainee and their families when they came home. I was fortunate to have played a role in many of those rescues, and they constituted victories for the families and for the hostages and for our country. But as I look back, I don't think of the people I brought home. I reflect on those who still await a reunion with their friends and with their families. And I think of the family members that must live every day with the uncertainty of having a husband or a father or a brother or a son or a sister or mother or daughter who's held captive overseas. I'm certain that President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and my successor, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, are committed to bringing the hostages and detainees home. The fact that the new administration retained Roger as the SPIHA demonstrates a seriousness on this issue. Now, it would be presumptuous of me to give any advice to President Biden, to Secretary Blinken, to Jake, to Roger, or Chris, but I will share 3 takeaways with you from my experience in the 2 roles as I work to try and bring Americans home. First, we must have a whole of government approach to bringing Americans home. This sounds elementary, but it's not easy. Departments and their subcomponents have missions that do not put the hostages first. And that's not because any one person in government doesn't want to bring Americans home. It's because the hostages are not their singular priority for their department or for their agency. Only Roger, for example, in the State Department, has the rescue of Americans as his only task. To bring the regional and functional bureaus and their great resources to bear on this mission requires Roger to break some glass and demand, as Churchill put it, action this day. Roger's singular focus on hostages and detainees will not make him popular in the halls of the Truman Building, but it's critical. At the HRFC, Chris, you'll need to take a similar approach with the intelligence agency, getting them to put hostages on the top of their collection priority list. You'll also need to encourage both law enforcement and military to constantly spin up plans to rescue hostages and detainees, even if those rescues may not receive a green light or the chances of getting them greenlit is remote. At the NSC, sub-PCs and PCCs will not be sufficient to move the bureaucracy. Deputies committee meetings and principal committee meetings are required to make the hostages and detainees a true interagency priority so that the interagency and the whole of government understands that bringing Americans home is a top priority of President Biden. Second, each hostage and detainee case is unique, and the solutions are thus different for each individual being held captive overseas. We obtained hostage and detainee releases through military raids sometimes. often by our special forces, and in other cases by relying on the special forces of our allies. We relied on third countries to negotiate on our behalf using diplomatic channels in certain cases and intelligence channels in other matters. We met directly and negotiated with captors where it was appropriate. We used well-known humanitarians and former officials to serve as intermediaries in some cases. We used prisoner cases in others, but only where the person released by the United States was nonviolent and where their term or a sentence was coming to an end. Open-mindedness on how to approach each case and creativity is critical to bringing our fellow Americans home. The one caveat is that government-paid ransoms are a short-term fix that result in more pain and misery for future hostages and their families. They create a market for hostages and are bad policy. Third, the hostages and detainees require advocacy, and no one advocates for hostages and detainees like their own families. You have a unique moral authority, and our senior-most officials care what you think, and they care about what you say, both privately and publicly. Be respectful of them and their time, but continue to be persistent in advocating at all levels of government for the hostages, from the president, the Secretary of State, and the National Security Advisors, down through the bureaucracies, all the way to the FBI agents who show up at your door to brief you or to inform you of news of what's happening with your loved one. I pass the baton as SPIHA to Roger and as NSA to Jake, but I continue to keep the hostages and detainees in my thoughts and prayers. And I continue to hold the baseball cards of the hostages that I didn't bring home at the end of my term with me. Diane, thank you again for all that you, Dr. Foley, and the foundation do to help our most vulnerable citizens who are held abroad. May God bless our hostages. May God bless our hostage families and detainee families. And may God bless the United States of America as we continue to engage in this important work. Thank you very much.